Hamburg in the 1700s was one of the most important cities in all of Europe. It was a free imperial city, answering to no king, no emperor, no single ruler. Its population had grown to well over 70,000 people by the mid-century, making it one of the largest and most prosperous trading hubs on the entire continent. Ships from England, the Dutch Republic, Scandinavia, and the Mediterranean all passed through its harbor. Merchants from across the known world walked its cobbled streets. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, engravings, and prints to life. These images were frozen moments, a single angle, a single light, a single day. But with today's technology, we can shift perspective, change the camera angle, and move through these same scenes in ways their original artists never could. What you're seeing is as close as we have ever come to actually being there. First, I want to talk about the harbor, the heart of the entire city.
The harbor and the Elbe River. This view shows the waterfront of Hamburg from the river, looking north toward the city. The year is somewhere around 1720. The Elbe is wide and gray-green here, and it is never quiet. Dozens of vessels sit at anchor. Tall-masted merchant ships, flat-bottomed barges, small fishing boats weaving between the larger hulls. The smell of salt water, tar, and fish is in the air at every hour of the day. Along the quayside, men unload barrels and crates in long human chains. Wool from England, spices from the East, grain from the Baltic, sugar from the colonies. The noise is constant, shouting in German, Dutch, English, Swedish, all mixing together over the creak of rope and timber. But the harbor had its dangers. The Elbe was unpredictable. Winter ice could lock ships in place for weeks. Floods came without much warning, and when the water rose, the lower streets of the city simply disappeared beneath it. Fire was the other great fear. Wooden ships, pitch, and open lanterns made for a combination that kept the harbor watch always nervous. Despite all of this, the harbor was why Hamburg mattered. By the early 1700s, it was one of the busiest ports in northern Europe. The city's wealth, its food, its politics, all of it flowed in and out through this stretch of the Elbe. Remarkably, Hamburg's waterfront still lines the same river today, and the Speicherstadt warehouse district nearby still echoes something of what once stood here.
The Rathausmarkt, the town hall square. This view shows the open square at the center of Hamburg's civic life. The old Rathaus, the town hall, dominates the background. By the early 1700s, this building had already stood for generations, its stepped gable facade rising over the square in the distinctive style of northern European merchant cities. The square below it was never empty. Market stalls crowded the foreground. Cloth merchants, butchers, and sellers of hot food all competed for space and for customers. Pigeons scattered underfoot, children ran between the legs of adults. In the midground, well-dressed merchants in long coats and broad-brimmed hats moved with purpose, surrounded by servants carrying packages. The Rathausmarkt was also where power was made visible. Public announcements were read here, punishments were carried out here. When Hamburg's ruling Senate made a decision on taxes, on trade, on war, it was in this square that ordinary citizens first heard the news. The relationship between the Senate and the city's population was not always a calm one. Hamburg had seen civic unrest and political tension in the late 1600s, and the memory of that friction still lingered in the early decades of the new century. Today, the square still exists in almost the same location, though the current neo-Renaissance Rathaus that stands there now was built in 1897, replacing the earlier structure. The Alster Lakes. This view shows the inner city from above, looking down over the Binnenalster, the inner Alster Lake, with the rooftops of Hamburg spreading out in every direction. In the 1700s, this artificial lake sat right at the edge of the city's dense urban fabric, its still water reflecting the spires of churches and the rows of tall merchant houses. On calm summer afternoons, small boats crossed the water. Wealthy families promenaded along the banks. But the Alster was also a working body of water. Mills had been built along its edges for centuries, and the flow of water through the city's canals and channels was carefully managed. Winter brought another mood entirely. When the lake froze, which happened in the harder winters of this century, the ice became a gathering place. Contemporary accounts describe vendors selling warm drinks, children skating, and crowds that formed almost spontaneously wherever the ice was thick enough to trust. The Alster remained central to Hamburg's identity throughout the century and beyond. Today, the Binnen Alster and the larger Außen Alster are still among the most recognizable features of the city, open water right in the middle of a modern European metropolis.
The merchant houses of the Dijkstrasse. This view shows a narrow canal street, the buildings pressing close on either side, their facades rising 4 and 5 stories above the dark water below. This is the Dijkstrasse, one of Hamburg's oldest and most important merchant streets, and in the 1700s it was where trade and domestic life existed almost on top of each other. The houses here were built tall and narrow. The ground floor opened onto storage, barrels, sacks, bales of fabric. The upper floors were where families lived, worked, and ate. Pulley systems hung from the attic gables, lifting goods directly from boats on the canal below. The architecture was entirely shaped by function. The smell here was overwhelming. Salt fish, animal hides, damp wood, and the slow rot of organic material in the canal water. Rats were a constant presence. Disease moved through these streets easily, and Hamburg suffered serious outbreaks of plague and fever through the late 17th and into the early 18th century. Living and working this close together, this close to standing water, carried real risk. And yet, these were the houses of prosperous men. Merchants who traded across half of Europe lived here, raised families here, and built Hamburg's wealth here. Remarkably, a small stretch of the Dijkstrasse still survives today, some of the oldest visible streetscape in the entire city. St. Petri Church. This view shows the tall spire of St. Petri rising above the surrounding rooftops, its stone tower pulling the eye upward from the tangle of streets below. St. Petri, St. Peter's Church, is one of Hamburg's 5 main Lutheran churches, and by the 1700s it had stood in some form on this site for centuries. Inside, the church was a place of serious Lutheran worship. Hamburg had been a Protestant city since the Reformation, and faith shaped the rhythm of daily life. Church bells marked the hours. Services drew large congregations. The pastors of these 5 main churches held real social authority. Their sermons were listened to, argued about, and repeated across the city. But the church spire was also practical. From the top of a tall tower, a watchman could see the harbor, the surrounding streets, and the approaches to the city. Fire watches operated from church towers because in a city of this density, a fire that went undetected for even a few minutes could mean catastrophe. St. Petri was badly damaged in the Great Fire of Hamburg in 1842, the fire that destroyed much of the old city center. It was rebuilt, and its rebuilt spire still stands today in the Altstadt. The Fischmarkt and the working waterfront. This view shows the lower waterfront district at dawn. The light is pale and cold. Fishing boats have already returned from the night's work, and the catch is being laid out on wooden tables and in baskets along the quay. This is the Fischmarkt, the fish market, and it began before most of the city was awake. The workers here were not the wealthy merchants of the Dijkstrasse. These were men and women who lived close to the edge, fishermen, porters, gutters, sellers. Their clothes were rough, their hands were calloused,
The work was physical, fast, and unrelenting, because fish spoils quickly, and there was always a buyer waiting somewhere in the narrow streets above. Gulls circled overhead. Cats threaded between people's legs. Barrowmen pushed loaded carts up the slippery cobblestone inclines toward the market halls inland. The smell was sharp and unmistakable. The social distance between these workers and the men in long coats who governed the city from the Rathaus was enormous. Hamburg was a place of great wealth, but that wealth was distributed very unevenly. The working waterfront was a world away from the merchant parlors just a few streets up the hill. The Fischmarkt still operates on Sunday mornings today, in almost the same location. It is one of the few places in Hamburg where you can stand and feel something genuine reaching back across the centuries.
The city walls and gates. This view shows Hamburg's fortifications from the outside, a wide earthwork wall and ditch system curving around the landward edge of the city, with a stone gate rising at the main road approaching from the south. By the early 1700s, Hamburg's defensive walls were still maintained, though the city had not faced a serious military siege in living memory. The gates were the checkpoints of their time. Every person entering or leaving the city on foot or by cart passed through one of these controlled openings. Customs officers collected duties. Travelers presented papers. Goods were inspected and sometimes confiscated. The gates opened at dawn and closed at dusk, and the city's population understood exactly what that boundary meant. Hamburg's status as a free city meant it had to defend that freedom, legally, diplomatically, and militarily if necessary. Maintaining the fortifications was expensive. The city employed soldiers, engineers, and inspectors to keep the walls and gates functional. This was not just architecture, it was a statement about sovereignty. Over the following century, the walls became less and less useful as a military structure, and by the early 1800s, much of the fortification system was dismantled. The land was eventually turned into the pleasant ring of parks, the Wallenangen, that circles Hamburg's old center today.
Today, the Opera House on the Gänsemarkt. This view shows a handsome building fronting a broad open square, the Gänsemarkt, with carriages drawn up outside and well-dressed figures moving toward the entrance. This is Hamburg's Opera House, and its story is a remarkable one. Hamburg opened one of the world's first public opera houses in 1678, not a court theater built for royalty, but a commercial venue where ordinary citizens, with money for a ticket, could attend. By the early 1700s, the opera on the Gänsemarkt was a thriving cultural institution. George Friedrich Handel himself worked here as a young composer before his fame spread across Europe, arriving in Hamburg around 1703. Inside, on a performance night, the audience was loud and opinionated. People ate, talked, and moved around during performances in ways that would surprise a modern concertgoer. The music was dramatic and emotional. Opera in this period was spectacle as much as art. The theater faced controversy throughout its existence. Some Hamburg clergy condemned it as immoral. Civic debates about whether the city should fund or tolerate such entertainments were fierce and recurring. The opera house eventually closed in 1338, a casualty of shifting tastes, financial pressure, and moral opposition. The Gänsemarkt still exists as a public square today, and Hamburg's love of music and performance never disappeared. It simply found new venues.
The Great Fire Risk, a city of wood and candlelight. This view shows Hamburg at night, the city's rooftops silhouetted against a dark sky, the harbor glittering faintly in the background, a single orange glow visible somewhere in the midground. It could be a lantern. It could be something worse. Fire was the defining threat of Hamburg's urban existence. In a city of closely packed wooden structures, narrow streets, and open flames, candles, hearths, forge fires, lanterns, the risk was never abstract. Hamburg had suffered serious fires before, and it would suffer the worst of all in 1842 when a 4-day blaze destroyed thousands of buildings in the city center.
In the 1700s, the city maintained a fire watch system, maintained water reserves, and trained volunteer companies to respond. Church tower watchmen scanned the skyline constantly. When an alarm was raised, the response was fast, because everyone knew that minutes mattered. The psychological weight of that risk shaped how Hamburg's people lived. It shaped building regulations, insurance practices, and neighborhood solidarity. People in this city knew their neighbors, in part because one day they might need them to help save their home. That vulnerability is easy to forget when you walk Hamburg's streets today, but it was the quiet background presence behind every candle lit and every fire stoked in the 1700s city.
The harbor at dusk. This view shows the Elbe again, this time in the last light of a late afternoon. The ships in the foreground are dark against the pale water. The city behind them is a line of spires and rooftops catching the final glow. Somewhere in that skyline is St. Petri and St. Nikolai and St. Michaelis, the great Michel, Hamburg's most beloved church, whose tower would become the city's defining symbol. This is Hamburg at the end of a day in the 1700s. The market is closing. The harbor watch is taking over from the day crew. The smell of coal smoke and river water drifts over the quays. Somewhere in the Dijkstrasse, a merchant is reviewing his ledgers by candlelight. In the Fischmarkt, tomorrow's preparations are already beginning. This city was alive in ways that are almost impossible to fully imagine, and yet, somehow, through these images, through the records that survive, through the streets and waterways that still carry the same basic shape, we can come close. That is what makes this kind of reconstruction feel meaningful. The past is not as far away as we sometimes think. These were real people, living real lives in a real place that still exists beneath the surface of the modern city. If there's another city, another century, or another scene you'd like to see reconstructed like this, let me know in the comments. I read every one of them, and your suggestions genuinely shape what comes next. Again, thank you so much.